They missed my son's funeral to taste wedding cake, then sat at my kitchen table and demanded I hand over his $1.4 million trust fund to pay for my sister's wedding. My son died on a Thursday. My parents were at a cake tasting. Nobody had called them. There was nothing to interrupt. Eli took his last breath at 4:47 p.m. 5 minutes later, my mother texted a laughing emoji about lemon buttercream. She sent it to our family group chat, the one that used to be for birthday reminders and dinner plans. That's how close it was. That's how little it mattered. I didn't answer the text. I sat on a plastic chair in a hospital hallway and held my husband's hand and listened to a nurse ask if we wanted a chaplain. Somewhere across town, my mother was deciding between lemon and almond. 9 months later, I sat at my parents' kitchen table in the black dress I still hadn't given away. My father had a spreadsheet printed on cardstock, the corners squared off like he'd trimmed them with a ruler. He slid it toward me the way you'd hand someone a job offer. "We've been waiting on you," he said. "Let's keep this calm, Claire." "I am calm," I told him. That scared him more than yelling would have. I watched it land, watched his jaw tighten. My sister Grace sat across from me in her wedding gown, not a photo of it, the actual dress, fresh from a fitting appointment 3 blocks away, crying into a folded tissue without smudging a single line of her mascara. She had never cried once while my son was dying. Not at the hospital, not at the funeral. She could cry on command for a spreadsheet, though. She'd always been good at crying for an audience. "Before we talk about my son's money," I said, "we're going to talk about my son." My mother's hand went flat on the table, like she was steadying herself. My father opened his mouth to redirect the conversation somewhere safer. I didn't let him. I reached down and lifted the black binder I'd brought, the one with 4 color-coded tabs, and set it beside his spreadsheet like a verdict beside a plea. "Claire," my mother started. I opened to the first tab. 97 minutes, I said. "That's how long the two of you spent with Eli across 18 months of treatment. I have the visitor logs. St. Ambrose keeps them at the front desk. I asked for copies in April." Grace's mascara finally gave way. "You don't understand what this has been like for me," she said, her voice cracking on cue. "Tell me," I said, and I meant it as a dare. "Tell me what it's been like for you." Nobody answered. My father's fingers drummed once against the spreadsheet, then went still. My mother's face had gone the color of old paper. "What do you want us to do?" my father finally asked, and his voice had lost the pitch meeting confidence it started with. I told him. The GoFundMe taken down within 24 hours. Every donor refunded, with an apology that named exactly what happened. A written acknowledgement, signed by both of them, that the trust would never be touched for Grace's wedding. Not now, not later. Not disguised as a loan, a gift, a family contribution, or anything else my father might dream up on cardstock. "And if we don't agree," my mother said, finding her spine again, her voice going sharp the way it always did right before she tried to win. I turned to the last page of the binder, the page I hadn't shown anyone yet. A business card was clipped to the top corner. Detective Rosa Delgado, Financial Crimes Unit, stapled above a document Grace had never seen and didn't know existed. My mother read the header upside down from across the table. I watched the color leave her face in real time, like someone had opened a valve. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. I didn't answer her yet. To understand why that document made my mother's hands start shaking, you have to go back. You have to understand who we were before any of this. Back when I still believed my family loved my son the way I loved him. Enough to show up, enough to fight for him, enough to at least put down the cake fork when the phone rang. I was 31 when Eli was born, and 37 the day I buried him. In between those two numbers is the whole story, and I've had a long time to sit with every piece of it. My husband Sam and I met in Cedar Falls, Ohio, at a community college night class neither of us needed, accounting for small business owners, taught by a retired CPA who fell asleep twice a semester. Sam was studying to become an electrician and taking the class because his uncle told him every tradesman needed to understand a balance sheet. I was already working toward my compliance certification. We got married 18 months later in his mother's backyard, 40 guests, a rented tent, and a cake his sister baked herself. My parents came. My mother cried, real tears that time, and told everyone at the reception that she'd never seen me happier. Eli was born on September 20th, 3 years into our marriage, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair that made the delivery nurse laugh out loud. My mother held him in the hospital for 40 minutes before anyone else got a turn. My father, a retired accountant himself, opened a savings account for him the same week, $3,000 seeded from his own pocket, the first of what he called Grandpa's college fund. For a while, I believed my parents were the kind of grandparents who showed up. They came to birthdays. They babysat on weekends so Sam and I could go to dinner. My mother kept a drawer of Eli's artwork at her house, labeled by year in her neat handwriting. Grace is 4 years younger than me, and growing up, she was the favorite in the quiet, structural way that doesn't get named out loud, but shapes a whole childhood anyway. She got the bigger bedroom. She got dance lessons I never got to take. When she failed out of her first semester of college, my parents called it finding herself. When I changed my major once sophomore year, my father sat me down for a talk about throwing away opportunities. Grace floated from job to job into her mid-20s. A boutique, a marketing internship that never turned into anything, a stretch of almost a year where she consulted without any clients that I ever heard about, and my parents subsidized all of it without ever calling it what it was. I didn't resent her for that, not really. I had my own life. I had Sam, and eventually I had Eli, and my parents' favoritism felt like background noise instead of an active wound. The clearest early example of it, the one I still think about, involved tuition. I paid my own way through community college and then a state university university, working part-time at a call center through both. Graduating with $11,000 in loans I finished paying off the year before Eli was born. Grace enrolled in a private out-of-state school my parents chose for her, at a cost of nearly $30,000 a year, and when she dropped out after 3 semesters, my father simply absorbed the loss and never mentioned it again, not even the time I asked, half joking, half not, whether there might be a comparable fund somewhere for me. He told me I'd turned out fine on my own, which I understood, even then, to be a compliment shaped like a door closing. I didn't raise the subject again. I told myself the money didn't matter. That character was built by the version of the story where you didn't get the easy road, and mostly I believed it. It's only in hindsight, holding everything else up against that same light, that I can see how early the pattern started, the specific, practiced ease with which my parents rewrote inconvenient math into a compliment, a life lesson, a you didn't need it anyway, while somewhere underneath, the actual arithmetic of who got what was being tallied exactly the way my father tallied everything. The incident that should have told me everything happened 3 years before Eli got sick, at my grandmother Vivian's 80th birthday party. Vivian was my father's mother, sharp as a blade even at 80, the kind of woman who noticed everything and said little. She pulled me into her kitchen that afternoon while the rest of the family ate cake in the backyard, and she told me she was setting something up for the great-grandchildren. Not for your parents to touch, she said, for the kids. When I go, I want it locked down tight, so nobody with a bright idea can get their hands on it. I remember laughing a little, thinking she meant it as a general precaution, the kind of thing wealthy old women say out of habit. I didn't understand yet that she meant my father specifically. Vivian died 8 months later. It wasn't until the reading of her estate that I learned she'd left an irrevocable trust of $1.4 million for Eli, her only great-grandchild at the time, structured so that it couldn't be touched, redirected, or borrowed against by anyone but a court-appointed trustee acting in Eli's sole interest. She'd named me trustee, not my father. Me. My father didn't take it well. He never said so directly. That wasn't his style. But for months afterward, he made comments at family dinners about how some decisions get made without the full family's input, and how he'd always assumed Vivian's estate would come back together, one way or another, for whoever needed it. I told myself it was grief talking. I didn't know yet that I was hearing a plan being drafted out loud, one dinner at a time. Eli was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 2 years after that, 3 weeks after his 6th birthday. He'd been tired for a month, bruising too easily, and I remember the pediatrician's face when the blood work came back, the careful, rehearsed calm of someone about to change your life. He carried a stuffed elephant named Milton everywhere after that, through every appointment, every infusion, every overnight stay. Milton's job, according to Eli, was protecting the vein. He said it with total seriousness, like Milton had been hired for a position and took the work personally. I believed him more than I believed most adults I knew. Sam and I effectively moved into St. Ambrose Children's Hospital for the next 18 months. Sam took unpaid leave twice. I worked remotely from a chair beside Eli's bed, running compliance audits on a laptop balanced on a rolling tray table, while monitors beeped beside me. My parents visited twice in that entire span. I know the number because I wrote it down, because somewhere in the 3rd month I started keeping a log without fully admitting to myself why. 97 minutes combined across 2 visits. My mother brought a coloring book the first time and left before Eli finished the first page. Grace visited 0 times. She got engaged to her boyfriend Derek during Eli's 4th month of treatment, and from that point forward, the wedding became the only subject that existed in my family. Venue tours, cake tastings, a charcuterie board she posted online the same afternoon Eli had a Metaport placed under general anesthesia. I remember staring at that photo on my phone in a hospital hallway, my son unconscious 2 floors up, my sister captioning a spread of prosciutto and manchego with 3 heart emojis. I texted her that night. He's scared, I wrote. Can you call him tomorrow? She answered in the family group chat instead, 20 minutes later, asking whether anyone had opinions on lemon versus almond cake. Nobody in the chat mentioned my son. I put my phone face down on the tray table and didn't pick it up again that night. The escalation didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one small enough that I could tell myself it was reasonable, until the pattern became too obvious to keep excusing. The first stage came during Eli's 10th month of treatment, right after his doctors started using the word remission out loud for the first time. I should have been relieved. Instead, that same week, my father called to ask if he and my mother could be added as backup authorized contacts on Eli's medical paperwork. Just in case, he said, for insurance purposes, since your mother and I are still his grandparents and we should be in the system. He asked for Eli's full legal name, his date of birth, and his social security number, which he said the insurance company required for the authorization form. I didn't think twice. My father had spent 30 years as an accountant. He understood paperwork better than I did. I emailed him the number that same afternoon, sitting in a hospital cafeteria, grateful that he was finally trying to be involved. A week later, my mother asked for a certified copy of Eli's birth certificate for our own records, in case anything happens to us and someone needs it. I ordered a second copy from the county and mailed it to her without asking why she needed the original document instead of a photocopy. I want to be honest about that moment because it matters later. I gave them everything they asked for. I trusted them with my son's identity because they were his grandparents, and because it never once occurred to me that trust could be the thing they were counting on. The second stage came 3 months after that, when Eli relapsed. The word aggressive entered our vocabulary, along with the word limited, spoken by an oncologist who chose his sentences with the particular gentleness doctors use when they're preparing you for the worst. I called my mother from the hospital parking garage, and I could hear her television in the background. Some home renovation show. Volume unmuted the entire call. When I finished explaining what the doctor said, there was a pause, and then she asked whether Grace should plan a fall wedding or wait until spring, since apparently these things take a full year to plan properly, and Grace didn't want to rush it. I remember standing in that parking garage with my phone against my ear, waiting for her to circle back to what I'd just told her. She never did. I told myself she'd misheard me, that the shock had scrambled her response, that surely she'd call back once it landed. She never called back. I responded reasonably, the way I always did. I sent a follow-up text a few days later with a clearer update, spelling it out in plain language this time. No room for confusion. She replied with a single thumbs up. The third stage arrived when Grace asked me to be a bridesmaid. I said yes because some part of me still wanted to believe we could be a normal family, that grief and celebration could exist in the same house without one swallowing the other. The dress fitting was scheduled for a Tuesday in March. The same week, Eli was readmitted for a fever that wouldn't break, the kind that sends a childhood cancer patient's whole care team into motion. I called Grace to explain I couldn't make the fitting, that Eli's counts were dangerously low and I needed to be at the hospital. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I know this is a hard time for you, but this is kind of a hard time for me too. I've been planning this for over a year." I didn't argue. I told her I understood, and I asked the bridal shop to email me measurements so I could get fitted separately once things settled down. That's the kind of accommodation I made, over and over, without ever once asking anyone to accommodate me. I remember standing in the hospital hallway that same Tuesday, phone still warm against my ear from the call with Grace, watching a nurse push a crash cart past a room 3 doors down from Eli's, my whole body going cold before I confirmed it wasn't for him. Grace texted 20 minutes later. A photo of bridesmaid dresses lined up on a rack, captioned, "Which one do you like best? Sorry you're missing this," with 2 exclamation points that felt, in that hallway, in that particular hour, like something closer to violence than carelessness. I didn't respond right away. When I did, hours later, once Eli's fever had broken enough for me to breathe again, I told her the sage green one looked lovely, because it did, and because some worn-down, dutiful part of me still thought performing normalcy might eventually produce the real thing. It never did. I understand now that the performance was the whole relationship, on her end and my parents' end both, a surface maintained carefully enough that anyone looking from outside would have called us close. Between the third stage and what came next, my mother tried a different tactic, one that took me longer to recognize because it didn't come from her directly. She called Sam's mother Patricia, a warm, well-meaning woman who'd always gotten along with my parents at holidays, and spent nearly an hour on the phone describing how worried she was about me, how isolated I'd become, how she feared grief was making me rigid and hard to reach, when really all the family wanted was to come together and support one another through Grace's wedding, a bright spot everyone needed right now. Patricia, who had no reason to doubt a grieving grandmother's account of things, called me gently that weekend to ask if I was doing okay, if maybe I was pushing my own parents away when I needed them most. I remember sitting on my back porch, phone against my ear, realizing my mother had reached past me entirely, into a relationship of my own that had nothing to do with her, and used it as a lever. I explained everything to Patricia as calmly as I could. The visits, the buttercream text, the venue deposits during Eli's final week, and to her credit, she believed me immediately, apologized for the call, and never brought it up again. But the attempt itself told me something. My mother had stopped trying to convince me directly, because direct conversation with me wasn't working anymore. She'd started trying to build a case against my judgment among the people around me instead, quietly, one borrowed relationship at a time. I responded the only way I knew how. I told the truth, plainly, to whoever asked, and let the truth do the work of correcting the record. The fourth stage was the one that finally showed me the shape of what I was dealing with, months before I had proof of anything. My father called during Eli's second relapse, the one where the word limited stopped being a possibility and became a timeline, and instead of asking how Eli was doing, he asked how the estate situation was progressing, whether the trustee paperwork had settled into a permanent structure yet. I didn't understand the question at first. When I asked him to clarify, he said something about wanting to make sure the family's resources stayed flexible enough to help whoever needed it most, and that Vivian, in his opinion, would have wanted the money to serve the living, not sit locked away for a situation that might not resolve the way we're hoping. I hung up the phone and sat in my car outside the hospital for 11 minutes before I could make myself go back inside. He was talking about my son's death as an event that would free up money. He was doing math on my child's life expectancy. I responded the way I responded to everything back then, reasonably, generously, giving people the benefit of every doubt I had left. I told myself grief made people say strange, clumsy things, that maybe he was trying to plan for a future he couldn't bear to think about directly. I didn't confront him. I didn't cut contact. I kept sending updates. I kept answering the phone. I kept being the daughter who managed everyone else's feelings about my son's illness instead of demanding they manage their own. Eli relapsed a final time in September, 3 weeks after his 8th birthday. The oncologist sat us down in a small room with soft chairs and a box of tissues already positioned on the side table, which told me everything before she said a word. Sam held my hand so tightly it left marks. We brought Eli home under hospice care on a Tuesday. He died the following Thursday, October 12th, at 4:47 in the afternoon, with Milton wedged under his arm exactly where he liked to keep him. I held his hand. It was smaller than it should have been for a boy who'd fought so hard for 2 years. 5 minutes after he stopped breathing, before I'd even called the funeral home, my mother texted the family group chat a laughing emoji about lemon buttercream frosting. I found out later, much later once I understood what I was actually looking at, that my parents had spent that entire final week of Eli's life finalizing venue deposits for Grace's wedding. $12,000 to a barn venue outside Cedar Falls, $4,000 to a florist, $6,000 to a photographer who specialized, according to her website, in golden hour love stories. They signed those contracts while my son was actively dying 20 minutes away. I didn't know any of that yet, sitting in the hospice room. I only knew the text about the buttercream glowing on my phone screen and the sound Sam made when I showed it to him. Not a word, just air leaving him all at once, like something had been kicked out from under his ribs. 11 people came to Eli's funeral. My parents sent a bouquet from a grocery store, the kind with a plastic sleeve still creased around the stems, and a card that said, "Thinking of you both," without mentioning Eli's name once. That same afternoon, while I stood at a graveside in a black dress I'd bought 2 days earlier because I didn't own one, my parents and Grace toasted champagne at a new venue 3 towns over. The barn, the one with the $12,000 deposit. Grace posted it that evening. A short video, golden light, clinking glasses, the caption reading, "A successful new beginning for our family." I saw it at 11 that night, unable to sleep, scrolling because scrolling was easier than sitting with silence. I read the word family 4 times before I closed the app. 2 weeks after the funeral, an envelope arrived from my grandmother's estate attorney confirming what I already knew, that Eli's trust, now that its sole named beneficiary had passed, would transfer under the terms of the trust document to a contingency structure that Vivian herself had specified years earlier, naming me as trustee of the transferred funds with discretion over eventual distribution to a charitable purpose or, at my judgment, to future great-grandchildren. We told no one in my family that this letter had arrived. Sam and I sat at our own kitchen table that night and agreed, without much discussion, that we needed time before we said anything to anyone. We didn't get that time. My mother opened mail that wasn't hers 3 weeks later. She'd stopped by our house to drop off a casserole, the first thing she'd done in over a year that resembled grandmotherly concern, and while I was in the kitchen, she went through a stack of unopened mail on the hallway table, looking, she said later, for a return address label she needed for something unrelated. She found the trust attorney's letter instead. She called me that same evening. "We need to talk about the trust," she said. No greeting, no preamble. "Your sister's wedding is falling apart while that money just sits there doing nothing. That money is connected to my son," I said. "It's not sitting there doing nothing. It's what's left of him. He's gone, Claire," she said, and her voice had none of the softness I'd have expected from a mother saying those words. "Grace is still here. She has a future ahead of her. Don't you want to see something good come out of all this?" I hung up the phone. I didn't cry. I remember being surprised by that, standing in my kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand, waiting for tears that didn't come. I think some part of me had already started building the wall I'd need for what came next. What came next was fast. Within a week, my father requested a formal meeting as a family to discuss the trust like adults. Grace posted a vague update on social media about an unexpected tragedy that had put a strain on wedding planning, never naming Eli, never naming me, phrasing it so generically that half her followers assumed something had happened to her personally. A GoFundMe appeared 4 days later under the name of one of Grace's college friends, titled "Help Grace Rebuild After Family Tragedy," with a goal of $10,000. The description mentioned unimaginable loss and a family trying to hold itself together, and included a single photo of Grace crying at what I recognized with a jolt as Eli's graveside, a photo taken from behind, at a distance, clearly without my knowledge or consent. The fundraiser raised $6,200 in 10 days from strangers who believed they were helping a grieving family recover. They had the wrong family member in mind entirely. I didn't scream. I didn't call my mother back and demand an explanation. I closed my laptop, sat very still at my kitchen table for a long time, and then I opened it again and started working, because working was the only language I had left that still made sense to me. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I'm a compliance analyst. I spend my working life reading financial records for patterns other people hope no one will notice. Mismatched dates, structured deposits, paperwork that looks clean until you check it against a timeline. I had never once turned that skill on my own family. I didn't want to believe I'd need to, but something about the GoFundMe photo, the angle, the timing, the fact that Grace's friend had access to an image taken at a private burial, told me this wasn't clumsy grief anymore. This was a campaign, and campaigns leave records. I started with the visitor logs because St. Ambrose keeps them for 18 months, and I wanted the number confirmed before it faded from institutional memory. The front desk supervisor printed them without asking why. 97 minutes combined across 2 visits, exactly as I remembered. I highlighted the entries in yellow and set the printout in a folder I labeled in black marker simply Mother. I started a second folder for my father, a third for Grace, a fourth for the trust itself. I didn't know yet what would go in each one. I only knew I needed somewhere to put what I found. I pulled our joint family text threads next, exporting them from my phone the way I'd been trained to export chat logs during workplace investigations, timestamps intact, nothing edited, the "keep the service small" message from my father, sent the morning of Eli's funeral. The lemon Lemon buttercream text from my mother, 5 minutes after Eli died, timestamp glowing at the top of the screenshot like an accusation. I laid them beside the venue contract dates I requested, legally through Vivian's estate attorney, who still had standing to request financial records tied to the trust's contingency clause, and watched a timeline build itself without my needing to argue anything. $12,000 to the barn venue, signed the Monday of Eli's final week. $4,000 to the florist, signed the Wednesday before he died. $6,000 to the photographer, signed the day of his funeral. I didn't need to write commentary next to those numbers. The dates did the talking. I called Miriam Cole, the estate attorney who'd handled Vivian's will, and now oversaw the trust's contingency terms, and asked her plainly whether my parents had any legal claim to the funds. She didn't hesitate. Zero, she said. Not a dollar, not under any theory. The trust names you as trustee with sole discretion. They could sue, but they'd lose, and they know it, which is exactly why they're trying to get you to hand it over voluntarily, instead of fighting you for it in a courtroom they'd lose in. That distinction mattered more than I understood at the time. A family that believes it has a legitimate claim goes to court. A family that knows it has no claim tries to guilt you into signing something instead. I hired a forensic accountant next, a quiet, exacting man named Paul Okafor, who'd spent a decade tracing fraud for a regional bank before going independent. I gave him everything: the venue contracts, the GoFundMe records, bank statements I'd requested from my parents months earlier under the pretense of settling some old shared expenses from Eli's care, which they'd handed over without suspicion because, I think, some part of them still believed I was too grief-stunned to read them closely. Paul worked for 11 days. When he called me back, his voice had a different register than our first conversation. Careful, deliberate, the voice of someone who'd found something they needed to explain slowly. "I need you to sit down for this," he said, and I told him I was already sitting. 4 months into Eli's treatment, a personal loan for $41,000 had been opened at a regional credit union in Cedar Falls. The loan wasn't in my father's name. It wasn't in my mother's name either. It was opened in Eli's name, using his social security number, his date of birth, and a certified copy of his birth certificate as identity verification, the exact documents my father had requested for insurance purposes, and my mother had requested for our own records, 11 months before Eli died. A 6-year-old boy, mid-chemotherapy, had a $41,000 loan opened in his name, co-signed with a signature the credit union had on file as his legal guardians, a signature that was not mine and was not Sam's. Someone had signed my name. Paul walked me through where the money went. $8,000 to a bridal boutique in Columbus, $6,000 to the barn venue as an initial hold, months before the deposits I already knew about, $4,200 to a jeweler for what I later learned was Grace's wedding band, custom set, ordered a full year before the actual wedding. The remainder had been drawn down slowly, in smaller withdrawals, over the following year. Cash advances, mostly, hard to trace to a single vendor but easy to trace to a pattern. A slow bleed of money from an account that belonged on paper to a dying child who had never signed anything in his life beyond a hospital consent form. His parents held his hand to complete. Paul sent the documentation over in a single encrypted file, 43 pages, every disbursement cross-referenced against a vendor name and a date, formatted the way I would have formatted it myself if I hadn't been too close to the subject to trust my own objectivity. I printed all 43 pages that same night at my kitchen table, the printer humming in the next room while Sam slept upstairs, and I read every line twice before I let myself believe it. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house at 2 in the morning when you're holding proof that the people who were supposed to protect you did the opposite instead. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I called anyone. I kept thinking about the birth certificate, the one I'd mailed my mother without asking a single question, trusting her because she was my mother and because some fossil layer of me still expected grandparents to be safe. I kept thinking about my father's phone call, the one where he asked about the estate situation while Eli was actively dying, and I understood now that it hadn't been clumsy or grief-addled at all. He'd been checking on an investment. I called Detective Rosa Delgado in the Financial Crimes Unit, a name Miriam Cole had given me, and I told her everything, laid flat and factual, the way I'd present a compliance finding to my own supervisors. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "This is identity theft of a minor," she said. "Using a deceased minor's identity to secure a loan is a federal offense on top of the state charges. I want you to send me everything Paul Okafor found. I also want you to understand something. You don't have to press charges for this to be real. But if you want it documented, if you want leverage that actually means something instead of just a hard conversation at a dinner table, I can open a file today." I told her to open the file. That's the document that was clipped to Detective Delgado's card in my binder, the one my mother read upside down from across the kitchen table, her face losing color like someone had opened a valve. "Where did you get that?" she'd whispered. I let the question sit in the air for a moment before I answered it. "From a forensic accountant, a bank's records department, and a detective in the Financial Crimes Unit," I said. "Would you like me to read it out loud, or would you rather I just hand it to Dad, since his signature is the one that isn't actually his?" My father's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It emptied out. All the pitch meeting composure, the squared-off spreadsheet corners, the calm authority he'd walked in with, it all drained out of him at once, and what was left looked old and frightened in a way I hadn't expected to feel anything about. I'd braced myself for his anger. I hadn't braced myself for the moment his hands started shaking too. "Claire," Claire, whatever you think you found, there's an explanation, he started. There's always an explanation, I said. I've heard 6 of them over the last 2 years. I'd like to hear this one, actually, because I'm curious what explanation covers opening a $41,000 loan in a 6-year-old's name and forging my signature to guarantee it. Grace's crying stopped entirely. Not slowed, stopped, like someone had cut the audio. She looked at our father, then at our mother, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, the particular vertigo of realizing the ground you've been standing on was never solid. What loan? She said, and her voice had lost every practiced tremor. Dad, what is she talking about? He didn't answer her. That silence answered for him. You didn't know, I said to Grace, and I meant it gently, because some part of the reasonable, accommodating person I used to be still existed in that room, even then. I believe you didn't know exactly where the money came from, but you knew it was there. You knew a $41,000 boutique bill and a barn venue deposit and a custom wedding band appeared during my son's chemotherapy, and you never once asked where any of it came from. That's not the same as innocence, Grace. That's just a more comfortable kind of guilt. My mother found her voice again, sharper now, the old instinct to attack when cornered. You're going to destroy this family over money that boy never even got to spend, she said. He's gone, Claire. He doesn't need it. We do. The room went very still. Even Grace flinched. Say his name, I said. My mother blinked. What? You haven't said his name once. Not today, not in 9 months. Say it. She opened her mouth, and for a moment, I actually thought she couldn't do it. That 2 years of treating my son as an obstacle or an inconvenience or eventually a financial event had erased his name from whatever part of her still functioned as a grandmother. Eli, she finally said, quiet, like the word cost her something. This isn't about Eli. It has never been about anything else, I said. You missed a cake tasting for him exactly 0 times. You missed every single appointment, every infusion, every night he was scared of the dark in a room that smelled like a hospital because it was one. You found time to open a fraudulent loan in his name, though. You found time for that. So don't tell me this isn't about him. He's the only reason any of us are sitting at this table. My father tried once more, quieter this time, the fight mostly gone out of his voice. We were going to pay it back, he said. Once the wedding was over, once things settled, we were going to pay back a dead child's identity theft loan with what? I said. You don't have $41,000 sitting around, Dad. That's the whole reason you needed the loan in the first place. You were never going to pay it back. You were going to keep taking, the way you always have, and hope nobody with my training ever looked closely enough to notice. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Outside, I could hear a neighbor's dog barking, ordinary and distant, like the rest of the world hadn't stopped the way this kitchen had. Here's what happens now, I said, and I laid out the terms the same way Paul had laid out the loan disbursements to me. Calm, sequenced, factual. The GoFundMe would come down within 24 hours. Every donor refunded from their own account, with a message that named exactly what had happened. No vague language about unexpected tragedy. A written statement, signed by both of them, acknowledging the trust would never be touched. Not as a gift, not as a loan, not disguised in any form for Grace's wedding or anything else. Full repayment of the fraudulent loan, in a structured plan Miriam Cole would draft and enforce, beginning immediately. And Detective Delgado's file would remain open, unresolved, a decision point I was keeping entirely in my own hands rather than theirs. Not a threat exactly, but not one either. And if we do all of that, my father said, you'll close it? Make it go away? I said the file stays open, I said. I didn't say what I'll do with it. That depends on what happens after today, not on anything you promise me in this kitchen. My mother's hands hadn't stopped shaking. Grace had gone very quiet, staring at the spreadsheet on the table, like it had turned into something unrecognizable. And for the first time since I'd walked in, nobody in that room was performing anything. Whatever they actually were, underneath all the crying and the calm authority and the squared-off cardstock, was finally sitting in full view for each other to see, not just for me. Grace reached out and grabbed my wrist before I could stand, her grip surprisingly firm for someone who'd spent the last 20 minutes falling apart. I'll pay you back, she said. The boutique, the ring, whatever they used for the venue. I'll figure out a way to pay every cent of it back myself. I swear to you, Claire. I didn't know, but I should have asked, and I'm asking now what I can do. I looked at her for a long moment. Some old, tired part of me wanted to tell her it was fine. The way I'd told her it was fine to miss the fitting, fine to post about cake flavors, fine to be somewhere else every single time it mattered. I didn't say that this time. You can start by telling the truth in public, the way you told a lie in public, I said. Take the GoFundMe down yourself. Don't wait for Mom and Dad to do it because they won't. Not really. Not honestly. And then you can spend some time thinking about why it took a fraud investigation for you to ask a single question about where any of this money came from. She nodded, and for the first time since I'd sat down at that table, I believed something she said without needing a document to confirm it. I love this family, I said, standing to leave. I still don't know if that was ever mutual, but I know what my son deserved, and I know none of you gave it to him. That's not something a spreadsheet fixes. I picked up my binder and walked out. Nobody followed me to the car. The next 6 weeks unfolded like a slow-motion collapse, the kind where you can see every piece falling and still can't stop watching. The GoFundMe came down within the 24 hours I'd demanded, but not because my parents took it down. Grace did, at 2 in the morning, along with a public post that named exactly what had happened. Not the fraud, not yet, but the essential shape of it. She wrote that donations had been solicited under false pretenses, that the tragedy referenced had been the death of her nephew, rather than any hardship of her own, and that every donor would be refunded in full within the week. She didn't ask my permission to post it. it. She didn't need to. I found out later she'd spent that entire night going through her own savings account, wiring back $6,200 to strangers who'd trusted a stranger's grief because she couldn't stand the idea of one more day passing with that lie still standing. It was the first thing she'd done in 2 years that cost her something real, and I noticed. Derek found out about the loan 9 days after the confrontation. Not from Grace and not from me, but from a credit inquiry that showed up on a joint account he and Grace had opened together for wedding expenses. A routine notification, the kind that flags unusual activity, that happened to surface the credit union's records during an unrelated dispute over a security deposit. He called Grace in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and according to Grace, who told me this part herself weeks later over coffee, the first thing he asked was whether any of the money funding their wedding had come from a source she couldn't explain. She told him everything, all of it. The venue deposit, the boutique, the ring he'd proposed with, financed in part by a loan taken out in a dying child's name. Derek postponed the wedding indefinitely 2 days later. I don't know everything that was said between them, but Grace told me he'd looked at her, not with anger exactly, more like grief, and asked how she could plan a life with people capable of that and never once ask where the money came from. She didn't have an answer for him. She still doesn't, as far as I know. My father's finances came apart next, and not gently. The $41,000 loan, combined with 2 smaller lines of credit Paul Okafor uncovered during a follow-up review, a department store card, and a second, smaller personal loan, both opened in Eli's name over the 18 months of his treatment, totaling another $9,000. Put my parents underwater in a way 30 years of careful accounting couldn't undo overnight. The credit union, once alerted to the fraud, froze the account and opened its own internal investigation, separate from Detective Delgado's file, which meant my parents were now facing scrutiny from 2 directions instead of one. My father, a man who had built his entire identity around being the responsible one, the one with the spreadsheet, the one who understood money better than the rest of us, spent that autumn fielding calls from a credit union's fraud department and an estate attorney's paralegal and, eventually, his own retirement fund manager, whom he'd quietly asked about early withdrawal penalties. My father made one last attempt to change the outcome before he accepted it, and it was, in its own way, the most revealing thing he did through the entire ordeal. In late October, 3 weeks after the confrontation, Miriam Cole's office received a filing from an attorney my father had quietly retained, petitioning the county probate court to review my standing as trustee, arguing that my emotional state following a recent bereavement raised questions about my fitness to manage the trust's assets responsibly. He cited no misconduct because there wasn't any to cite. The filing leaned entirely on grief itself as a disqualifying condition, as though surviving my son's death made me less capable rather than more determined. Miriam called me the afternoon it landed, and I remember laughing once, sharp and involuntary, at the audacity of a man who'd forged my signature on a loan application, trying to argue in front of a judge that my judgment couldn't be trusted. The petition was dismissed at the first hearing. The judge, according to Miriam, spent less than 4 minutes on it before ruling from the bench, noting dryly that Vivian's trust document was explicit, that I had committed no violation of my duties, and that the petitioner might want to reflect on whether his own conduct, not his daughter's grief, was the more relevant subject for the court's attention. My father paid his attorney's retainer, lost, and never mentioned the filing to me directly. I only know the details because Miriam kept me informed, the way she'd kept me informed of everything, methodically, without editorializing, letting the facts carry whatever weight they carried on their own. My mother tried one more time to reach me in November, with a letter instead of a phone call. Handwritten, 4 pages, the kind of letter that starts with an apology and slowly turns into a defense. She wrote that she'd never meant for things to go so far, that grief had made her say things she regretted, that surely I understood a mother's instinct to protect all her children, not just the one who was gone. She used the word gone instead of Eli's name 3 separate times in that letter. I noticed. I always notice things like that now. It's become a kind of professional deformity, reading a document for what it avoids saying as carefully as what it says. I didn't respond to the letter. Some silences aren't cruelty. Some silences are just the only honest answer left. Not everyone in my family disappeared into the wreckage, though, and that surprised me more than the collapse itself. My father's sister, my Aunt Denise, called me the week after the confrontation, furious in a way I'd never heard from her before. She'd learned the full story from Grace, who'd called her crying, unable to hold it alone anymore. Denise drove 4 hours from Michigan the following weekend, sat at my kitchen table, a different table, a safer one, and told me she'd suspected for years that her brother had a blind spot the size of a house when it came to money and control, but she'd never imagined it would touch a child. She brought a small wooden box with her, one Vivian had given her decades earlier, containing a handful of photographs of my father as a boy that Denise thought I should have, since apparently no one else in the family seemed inclined to remember who he used to be before he became this. It wasn't forgiveness for him. It was something else, a reminder that not every branch of a poisoned tree carries the same rot, and that family, when it's working the way it's supposed to, sometimes shows up 4 hours late with old photographs instead of 9 months late with a spreadsheet. My cousin Jenna, Denise's daughter, reached out too, awkward and sincere, offering to help however she could, though neither of us was quite sure what that meant yet. A handful of cousins I hadn't spoken to in years sent messages, some clumsy, some careful, most of them some version of "I had no idea. I'm so sorry. Let me know what you need." I didn't need much from any of them. him. I needed, mostly, to be believed, and for the first time since Eli's diagnosis, I was. The barn venue added its own tangle to the mess. Once word of the fraud reached the venue's owner, through Grace, who felt she owed an explanation after canceling, the venue refused to return the $12,000 deposit, citing a strict no-refund clause buried in paragraph 9 of a contract nobody had read closely at the time they signed it. My father spent 3 weeks on the phone with the owner, and then, when that failed, with a small claims mediator, trying to recover money that had, in a sense, never really been his to spend in the first place. He lost that fight too. The florist kept half her deposit. The photographer, to her credit, refunded everything once she learned the circumstances, along with a short, kind email to Grace that Grace showed me months later, the only unprompted kindness that came out of a vendor relationship built on money that should never have existed. I found a strange, quiet satisfaction in watching all of it unwind through ordinary contract law, the same slow, procedural machinery I used every day at Hartwell. No drama required, just paperwork finally being read the way it should have been read from the start. The first Christmas after the confrontation was the quietest one Sam and I had spent together in years, and also, unexpectedly, one of the better ones. No group chat buzzing with photos of a tree at my parents' house. No obligatory visit, timed and dreaded in advance. Just the two of us. A small tree in the living room. Milton propped against one of the ornament boxes, like he'd been invited to help decorate. Denise called on Christmas morning, the first of what became a standing tradition, and Jenna sent a care package with a card that made me cry for reasons that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the strange relief of being thought of by someone who expected nothing back. A few co-workers at Hartwell, the ones I'd quietly confided in during the worst stretch of that autumn, sent flowers to the office with a note that just said "We see you," which undid me more than almost anything else that season, because it was the plainest, least complicated form of care I'd been offered in over a year. There was a night in early December, the first real snow of the year settling outside our windows, when Sam found me sitting on the floor of Eli's old room, the one we hadn't touched since the hospice bed had been wheeled out 14 months earlier. I was holding Milt, the stuffed elephant, turning him over in my hands the way Eli used to when he was thinking hard about something. Sam sat down beside me without saying anything for a long time. Eventually, he asked what I was thinking about, and I told him the truth. I was grieving two things at once, and I hadn't realized until that moment that they were separate griefs. One was for Eli, uncomplicated, bottomless, the kind of loss that doesn't get smaller, only quieter. The other was for the family I'd thought I had, the version of my parents who showed up for 40 minutes in a hospital room and cried real tears at my wedding, who I'd spent 2 years hoping might still exist somewhere underneath the spreadsheet and the loan applications. If I just kept being patient enough, reasonable enough, forgiving enough, that family had never really existed, not the way I remembered it. Or maybe it had, once, briefly, and had quietly died somewhere along the way without a funeral of its own. Either way, I was allowed to miss it. Sam didn't try to talk me out of the grief. He just sat with me on the floor until my legs went numb, and then he made tea, and we didn't talk about spreadsheets or loans or trust funds for the rest of that night. The legal side resolved slower than any of the emotional side did, the way these things usually do. Miriam Cole structured a repayment plan for the fraudulent loans, enforceable through a civil judgment my parents agreed to, rather than risk a criminal referral moving forward on Detective Delgado's file. It took most of a year, monthly payments drawn against my father's retirement withdrawals, tracked and confirmed by Miriam's office, every payment logged the way I log everything now, time-stamped, saved, backed up in 3 places. Detective Delgado kept the file open for 4 months before I made my decision. I didn't press criminal charges in the end. Not out of forgiveness, exactly. I told her, and I told myself, that criminal charges against a 63-year-old man with no prior record would cost the state more than it would ever recover, and would turn my son's name into a headline detail in a fraud case instead of what I wanted it to remain, a name people said with love, not a case number. Detective Delgado closed the file at my request, with a note in the record that made clear exactly what had happened and why it hadn't proceeded further. My father knows that note exists. He knows I could have made a different choice. I think, in its own quiet way, that knowledge has done more to change him than a courtroom ever would have. It's been a little over a year since that afternoon at the kitchen table now. I still live in Cedar Falls, in the same house Sam and I bought before Eli was born, though we repainted his room a soft gray last spring, not to erase him, but because the walls had started to feel like a museum instead of a home, and I didn't want a museum. Milton sits on a shelf in the living room now, where I can see him every day, instead of tucked away in a closet where grief goes to be managed instead of lived with. I still serve as trustee of what remains of Vivian's gift. Most of it stays invested, the way my grandmother intended, held for a future I don't yet know the shape of, but I directed a portion of it, $200,000, toward establishing a fund at St. Ambrose Children's Hospital, in Eli's name, covering unpaid parking and lodging costs for families who live too far from Columbus to drive home between treatments. It's a small thing. In the scope of $1 million trust, it felt like the only thing that made sense. Vivian told me once, in her kitchen, that she wanted the money locked down tight so nobody with a bright idea could get their hands on it. I think about that a lot. I think she saw something in my father decades before I let myself see it. And I think she trusted me, specifically, to be the one who'd eventually understand. Grace and I talk occasionally now, carefully, the way you talk to someone you're rebuilding trust with one small transaction at a time. She and Derek separated for a while after the wedding was called off, though I heard through Denise that they've started seeing each other other again, slower this time, with what Grace described to me as actual conversations instead of a venue calendar. She apologized to me in person once in October at Eli's grave, of all places, the first time she'd been there since the funeral. She stood a few feet back while I cleared leaves off the headstone, and she said she was sorry, not for the loan, which she still maintains she genuinely didn't know about, but for every cake tasting she chose over a hospital visit, every group chat message about flowers when she should have been asking about his fever. I told her I believed she meant it. I didn't tell her everything was fine, because it isn't, and I've stopped pretending forgiveness has to look like pretending. We're rebuilding something. I don't know yet what shape it will take. My parents and I don't speak. My mother sends a card at Christmas, unsigned by my father, with a few careful lines that never mention Eli by name and never ask to see me. I don't respond, and some years I don't even open it until spring. That isn't cruelty. It's just the most honest answer I have. My father completed his repayment plan 8 months ago. The final installment logged and confirmed by Miriam's office like every payment before it. He hasn't asked to see me since. I think some part of him understands that the debt he actually owes was never denominated in dollars, and that no repayment plan exists for the other kind. Miriam told me once near the end of that year that in 30 years of estate law, she'd rarely seen a family document its own unraveling so thoroughly. In its own words, without any help from opposing counsel. I didn't feel proud when she said it. I felt tired, mostly, and something close to vindicated, though vindication turned out to be a much quieter, much lonelier feeling than I'd ever expected it to be, sitting there in her office with the final signed page still warm from the printer. I go back to work full-time now, still a compliance analyst, still spending my days reading other people's paperwork for the patterns they hope no one notices. There's a strange symmetry in that, one I didn't choose on purpose but have made peace with. The training that let me see through my own family's spreadsheet is the same training I use every day to protect strangers from people exactly like them. I don't know if that's justice or just coincidence wearing a tidy shape. Some days it feels like both. Sam and I talk about having another child sometimes, carefully, in the tentative way you approach a subject that used to be simple and isn't anymore. We're not there yet. Some days I think we will be. Other days I think the space Eli left behind is still the loudest room in the house, and I don't want to fill it before I finish learning to sit in the quiet of it. Either way, whatever comes next in our family, it will be built the way our marriage always has been. Around showing up, on the ordinary days as much as the terrible ones, because I learned the hard way what happens to the people who only show up for the second kind. I kept the binder. It sits in a drawer in my home office now, the 4 tabs still labeled in black marker, Eli's 8th birthday photo still tucked behind the last divider. I don't take it out often, but I know exactly where it is, and some nights that's its own kind of comfort. Proof that when it mattered most, I didn't look away, and I didn't wait for someone else to. People ask me sometimes, gently, whether I regret how far I took things. The binder, the forensic accountant, the detective's file sitting open for 4 months, like a blade I chose not to use. I don't. I regret instead that it was ever necessary. I regret that a family which should have shown up for 97 minutes and instead showed up for 18 months would have made an entirely different story than the one I'm telling you now. I regret that Grace learned who our parents really were through a credit alert instead of through years of being told the truth by people who loved her enough to risk the relationship over it. If there's a thesis to everything I've told you, it's this. Love that only shows up when it's convenient was never love to begin with. It was a placeholder, waiting to see if something better came along. And for my parents, a wedding with a cake tasting and a photographer who specialized in golden hour turned out to be the something better. My son deserved grandparents who put down the fork when the phone rang. He deserved a family willing to sit in a hospital hallway at 4:47 on a Thursday afternoon instead of a family choosing between lemon and almond 3 miles away. He got neither, and no amount of restitution, no repayment plan, no fund established in his name at the hospital that couldn't save him will ever change that fact. I've made a kind of peace with it, the way you make peace with a wound that scars over but never fully disappears, invisible, manageable, no longer bleeding but never, not for one single day, forgotten. They missed my son's funeral in every way that mattered, long before they missed the actual afternoon of it. They were tasting cake while he was learning to be brave in a hospital bed, and no spreadsheet, no binder, no detective's file will ever hand me back the version of my family that should have been there instead. I closed that door, finally, at my own kitchen table, in a black dress I still haven't given away. Some days that feels like victory. Most days it just feels like the truth, sitting where grief used to be, waiting for me to learn how to live beside it.